I had no idea that all your theaters are basically controlled by the government, that you cannot get anything into the theater unless you go through the government and they approve what you are saying and that it can be in Canada.
I am a husband, a father, a lawyer, a Christian, and a proud Canadian. I started this series because it was clear that our nation needs truth. Not just another biased narrative, but real information of substance. We need access to facts and the freedom to think for ourselves. I'm Halliday Grey, and this is Grey Matter.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Grey Matter. Well, you know, it's hard to imagine for some people that not much more than a year ago, in places like Alberta, Canada, and California and the United States, we were locked down. We were restricted in where we could go and what we could do and how far apart we were supposed to stand from each other. And we were wearing masks. Well, one of the things that is troubling about that time, that period of the pandemic, and isn't talked about enough, is how the church responded, how the Christian churches in Canada and the United States responded to being locked down, to being told that their churches had to close, to restrict the number of people who could attend and the ways that they could worship, having to stand 6 feet apart, not being able to share fellowship or take communion. Well, we have a guest on today who has actually had the opportunity to create and direct and write a new film called The Essential Church about that really important time in our history and to document that for us. And his name is Shannon Halliday. Welcome to the program, Shannon. It's great to see you again.
Oh, it's great seeing you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, I remember well having you and your entire crew in my office, and you guys just took over. You were so professional, and I'm actually very proud and excited to have a small role in this new documentary, which I understand is coming out. It's going to premiere on the 23rd of July, right?
It's premiering there, but really it's coming out the 28th. That's our big day, July 28th in the States. We're hoping to have a theatrical release nationwide.
All right. So I'm excited to talk to you about this. I know that you wrote the script to this movie, and that you've also been the director. A couple of my clients, both of whom who have been guests on this program, are, I guess, stars or featured in the film. We're going to dive into it. Before we go there, as we always do, we're going to frame our discussion with a few aphorisms, quotations. The first one is from Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that the constitutional freedom of religion is the most inalienable and sacred of all human rights. Secondly, from another giant of the American constitutional period, Thomas Paine, who wrote that spiritual freedom is the root of political liberty. As the union between spiritual freedom and political liberty seems nearly inseparable, it is our duty to defend both. And finally, from a man we're going to talk about today, who's very important to the movie and, of course, the church that is behind it all, Mr. John MacArthur, who was quoted as saying, "In a world of selfishness, greed, inequity, and injustice, believers need to be set apart by their consuming love for God and their sacrificial love for others. That's the kind of holy living that brings salt and light to this dark, decaying world." So I want to start off with you, Shannon, by maybe talking a little bit about a big part of what you're doing then is your truth-telling through your film. And that's a big part of what's going on in the Essential Church, right?
Yeah, that's right. We saw this as an opportunity to tell the truth about a story of how things unfolded. And it really its genesis came from the fact that when we decided to open, a lot of people left our church. A lot of people were upset with us and thought we were doing the wrong thing.
Right.
And they thought that John MacArthur went off the rails. They thought we were all just going along with it. And you couldn't tell them otherwise, and you couldn't convince them otherwise. And so the idea became, well, what if we made a movie about this that kind of pulled back the curtain, even on our own church, and showed the process that our elders and what the church had to go through to come to the conclusion that we're actually going to sue the government, and we're going to take a stand and take it to them legally.
Yeah.
You know, if you would have told me before COVID that Grace Church was going to sue the government, I would have said, no way. We're a
Yeah.
church that teaches that you should submit to the government, that the government is ordained by God. And the Bible says that. But that's the interesting thing, is that there is another side to the coin when understanding that. And
Right.
people that left were only looking at the one side of the coin. And we wanted to make sure we showed that other side of the coin by doing this film.
Right.
So it's just a great story to tell, too. This is, you know, at the time, I don't know if people realize how kind of historical this was. And we want to make sure that we, you know, put our stake in the ground and that people remember what happened and tell that story and tell it well.
Yeah. One of the amazing things about Grace Church is how prepared they seem to have been for the pandemic. In fact, I noticed in one of the trailers, there's an old recording of one of Mr. MacArthur's sermons where he actually talks about, you know, what would happen, what would we do if they tried to shut down the church. It was like from 1975 or something. And there's a quotation on here from you know, from the website for the film. It says, "Christ is the one true head of his church, and we intend to honor that vital truth in all our gatherings. For that preeminent reason, we cannot accept and will not bow to the intrusive restrictions government officials now want to impose on our congregation." And so it's remarkable how, I guess, properly situated Grace Church was to take on this battle, which was, let's face it, it was a bit of a David and Goliath. But ultimately, they won. They actually won, and that's a brilliant story that's told in the film. Am I right?
Absolutely, and that part is actually in the film as well, where that tape is found. The tape, you know, he has a sermon ministry called Grace to You, where all of his sermons are recorded and then distributed. And back in the 70s, it was distributed through tape. So we actually find the tape from 1975 and play that.
That's amazing.
Yeah, but here's the interesting thing. I think people see that and they see John MacArthur and they think, oh, all of Grace Church agreed. They were all unanimous. They were all perfectly prepared for this. And they instantly made the right decision, and there was no drama, no division. But that's actually not true. And so there was division amongst our elders. There was, at one point, I mean, that's John MacArthur got it right in 1975. And then when he heeded the warning of like, okay, the government's never said this before, and I have it in the documentary where he says it's like they're saying a hurricane is going to come and everybody's going to die. So obviously we're going to be like, well, they must know what they're talking about, right? But we're ignorant to what actually was coming. And so when it was clear that it was not what they said it was, and he wanted to open back up, you know, he can't just do that. He's not the leader of he's a leader and he's our senior pastor, but we have 40 elders. So 40 elders actually have to become unanimous in their decision. That's how we process. We're an elder church, and they have to be, they have to have unanimity in everything they do. And if they don't have it, they have to iron it out until they do. So
they were unanimous in making the decision to stay open then.
Correct. They had to become unanimous, but that was a process. So it wasn't just John MacArthur running roughshod, doing whatever he wanted to do. You had to get 40 men who actually had various opinions on this matter to all agree. And there is a process of evolution in their theology. And I actually go into that into the documentary. It's very interesting. So I actually pull back the curtain and you can kind of see that process of how they got to the point of where they became unanimous. And it wasn't without cost. They actually lost some elders over this. Yeah.
And so I'm sure there was a discussion about Romans 13 and obedience to the state and things like that.
Yes.
I wonder how that all got worked out so that they became unanimous in standing up to the government's tyranny.
Yeah. We have a pastor called his name is Mike Riccardi, and he was kind enough and humble enough to kind of share his evolution on the matter, because he was very much on the we are doing the right thing by shutting down. And he tells a story about how a friend of his challenged him and challenged him to look at Romans 13 again and to read some other resources that would help him in his studies. And one of those was Martin Lloyd-Jones. I don't know if you're
Right.
familiar with him,
I
but
have heard of him. Yes.
yeah, Martin Lloyd-Jones was an amazing preacher in the 50s and 60s.
Hmm.
I think you can actually still hear some of his sermons on the Martin Lloyd-Jones Trust or Foundation. It's
Oh,
free,
that's a
it's a
blessing.
podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. But basically, they took his sermons on Romans and made commentaries out of it. And he has an excellent one on Romans, dedicated to Romans 13, the chapter. And he talked about how he discovered that the Bible actually teaches that there are spheres of authority, that there is
Right.
the family sphere, there is the state sphere, and that there is the government sphere, and that they are
Hmm.
all ordained by God, but they all work coordinate to one another, not one on top of the other, but all answering to
Right.
God.
Right.
And so the concept of the separation of church and state comes from the Bible, which is
Right.
hilarious, because you'll see the atheists going to a courthouse saying we need to remove that statue of the Bible or of the Ten Commandments because this is we need to have separation of church and state, and that's showing favoritism. And I'm thinking to myself, that's the only way we know about the separation of church and state. It's actually taught
Right.
in the Bible. So you're
Yeah.
removing the thing that actually gives us what our country is actually based on.
Hmm. Yeah.
So,
Atheistic wisdom. In any case, I want to get back to the film and talk about one aspect that we haven't discussed yet, and that is location. I know for a director, this is a huge thing. And so you weren't just filming in California, you actually came to multiple locations in Canada, and also you were over in Scotland, right? In Edinburgh. You want to talk about some of the challenges and the excitement of filming in multiple locations like that?
yeah. First of all, I'll start with Scotland, and Scotland is amazing. So if you ever have a chance, I don't know if you've been there. It's
I have not yet. I'd
oh,
love to go there. Yeah.
man, it is beautiful. It is a great country. But when I got the opportunity to do this film, and I was putting together the pitch, and then when I got that improved writing the script, one of the things that I wanted to make sure was a part of the film was the aspect of church history.
Right.
Because there are parallels in church history with what we went through in 2020.
Hmm.
So I thought that was an interesting parallel. There were actually parallels even in certain days and dates, which if you see the film, you'll see the connection that I make there. It's very interesting. But that takes us to Scotland, because one of the things that our statement that we came out with, called Christ Not Caesar, when we came out with that on they voted on July 23rd, and then it was put out July 24th, 2020.
Yeah.
It references church history, specifically the Covenanters and the Puritans and the Great Ejection. So the Covenanters
Right.
are Scottish, and that takes us to Scotland. And so I
Right.
wanted to go there because there was certain ways that I was going to weave that into the story. And I had a couple interviewees out there. One gentleman called Ian Hamilton, who's a Scottish Presbyterian pastor. And I wanted to interview him. And he really does an amazing job in telling these stories about the Covenanters, about the Great Ejection. And that's what I really, as a filmmaker, was excited about this, because I really leaned into the storytelling of that history. So it's not just a bunch of academic talking heads. This really is storytelling.
Right.
And I love it. I love the opportunity to do that, and I was super excited. So I went there, and I was filming certain locations at Scotland that moves with our story, as well as interviewing Ian Hamilton. Then, of course, we went to Canada, because another aspect of this film that was very important to me was the global aspect of it. And I thought the best way to represent that was the Canadians and what they went through.
Yeah.
And it's not just about Grace Church, it's about the church. And I want to make sure that that's understood historically. That's why we go to the past. And I want to make sure that we're looking at it globally. That's why we went to Canada. What happened there was, I mean, I'm always amazed.
The word I use is appalling.
Yeah, I'm appalled, amazed at how screwed up Canada is.
Oh, I know.
I'm fascinated by it because I would
Yeah.
think that they're similar in, we're looking, for example, we're trying to distribute this film. We look into Canada and the theaters there. I had no idea that all your theaters are basically controlled by the government. That
Yes.
you cannot get anything into the theater unless you go through the government and they approve what you are saying and that it can be in Canada.
Yeah.
And I don't know of anything more totalitarian than that because
Yeah.
they get it. They're saying we're going to control the storytelling because we know
Hmm.
that storytelling is what equips people to think
Yeah.
and live their life. So we're going to control the stories that are told in Canada. And that's
Right.
appalling to me. Anyway,
Yeah.
I digress. The church was feeling the brunt of that totalitarianism in Canada. And
Yes.
we saw the fruit of that, and we got to see what was really going on up there. And the
Hmm.
fact that pastors were imprisoned
Yeah.
is, I cannot believe that. I mean, when that was
Yeah.
happening, I'm like, what is going on in Canada?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, we were threatened with imprisonment, but there was also in the back of our mind, let's see them try it. They
Yeah.
threatened with us. Let's see if they have the guts to do it. Well, they did in Canada. They had no
Yeah.
problem
Sure
doing
did. Yeah. Grace Church in Stony Plain, that's James Coates's church. As you know, not only was Pastor Coates imprisoned, and he was held under a condition of bail that he could not accept, which essentially would violate his religious conscience, would prevent him from preaching the word of God, which is his sacred vocation. But the church itself was triple barricaded for months. It was turned into a police barracks for all the world to see. That is a mark of shame that I don't think will ever be removed from our nation and from our province of Alberta. And it really is truly horrifying. Then, of course, we have Timothy Stevens in Calgary, who, if you can believe it, was imprisoned because he was holding an outdoor church service. He was actually having to move his congregation around to undisclosed locations. And they had a drone follow him around and finally catch him, under and arrest him under because he violated this draconian order that you could not have large gatherings outside. It really is hard to imagine, but the scary thing is, and I hope people will get out and see this film, is that all of this could happen again. All the emergency powers that were used in Canada and elsewhere are still in place. I don't know of any government that's swept them aside, and so this danger, still persists if we are not vigilant, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons we made the film. We want to put steel in the veins of Christians around the globe that when this happens again, they think about, no, the church is not the government's jurisdiction. They don't
Yeah.
control the polity of the church. They don't control how we worship. They don't have any say in that. And individuals, quite frankly, are smart enough to figure out what they need to do medically. The church is not the police of that, and
Right.
neither is the government. So,
Right.
anyway, yeah, that's the point of the film, to put steel in the veins of those folks. And you mentioned how they barricaded the church and they were going to secret locations. And I mentioned earlier that there's a parallel in church history. Well, during the Great Ejection, there were over 2,000 ministers ejected from their pulpit because they would not submit.
Really?
Yeah, they would not submit to the guidelines that the state was telling them how to do church. And
Right.
some of those guidelines weren't necessarily bad. They were
Mhm.
kind of amoral. It wasn't like, you could or couldn't do it. The Bible didn't necessarily forbid it, but what the Bible doesn't say is that the government has the right, the state has the right to be the head of the church.
Right.
Only Christ is the head of the church, not the government. So the very idea that they were saying we're going to be the head of the church, the king, the monarchy, which essentially is the state, is going to run the church.
Right.
We can't just hand that over. And they were
Yeah.
ejected from their pulpits because of that conviction. And get this, they started to have secret church, just like the Canadians. But the government recognized that some of these people were having secret church. So they made a law called the Conventicle Act. The Conventicle Act forbid people gathering past a certain number, if that sounds familiar to you.
Yeah, it sure does.
And only family members and non-family members couldn't meet with you. So if you had a gathering over a certain amount of people and they were non-family members, you were breaking the law. So isn't that an interesting parallel,
It
that the
is.
government was trying to control the church through that as well, or just the gathering of it? And I thought, oh, that's so fascinating. And
Yeah.
there's lots of parallels like that with the Book of Common Prayer and the guidelines, and what happened with the whole concept of the, Christians in the 1600s had to flesh out the concept of why they could tell the state, no, we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
And they had to flesh it out biblically because they were Christians. They wanted to be true to the Bible. So they had to biblically flesh out those concepts of why we can say that. And, it's interesting, like the Bible says for the wife to submit to the husband, but the Bible doesn't say for the wife to submit to the husband when the husband does something he's not supposed to be doing. It doesn't say, submit to his sin and disobey God. It doesn't say, so there obviously is a qualifier there. We're called to submit to the government, but if the government is doing something we know they're not supposed to be doing, like trying to take over the church, we don't submit to them in that, obviously.
Right.
It's not a blanket submission, just like it wouldn't be a blanket submission to the wife to her husband, So, it's a similar thing.
Well, one of the things that unfolded, there's the old adage that, what the devil does for evil, the Lord turns for good. And one of the incredible things that's happened, that's come out of the COVID-19 lockdowns, is that although it's saddening and concerning that so many churches, just rolled over and submitted to government tyranny and closed their churches down, though the churches that stood up, the ones like Pastor Coates and Pastor Stevens and others, that they have attracted so many people to their churches. I know from speaking to Pastor Coates that the size of his congregation has tripled in the aftermath of this. I mean, to me, this is a really encouraging sign. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And the churches that shut down really missed an opportunity to let their light shine for Christ. They really missed an opportunity. There's a story, a testimony in the documentary of a gentleman in Canada who he woke up in the hospital. He had a stroke, and he woke up in the middle of COVID, and then he eventually went home, but everything was shut down. He suffered with depression. He started suffering with alcoholism, and everything was shut down. And he's on the verge now. He's in this dark place where he's considering suicide. And he hears on the news that Tim Stevens' church is open, this little Baptist church in Calgary. And he says, well, you know what? I'm going to go there. What else what do I got to lose?
Right.
And he went there. He heard the gospel. He heard that the whole truth, that he is a sinner, depraved, that he is in need of atonement, that it's Christ who does that atoning work full and complete for him. And he repented and believed in Christ, the Son of God. And now he's a Christian. He's no longer an alcoholic. Incredible. And he has hope. So if the church, if Tim Stevens' church shut down, that wouldn't have happened. You can't shut down the church in the midst of the darkest moment in history. That's when the church is supposed to shine.
That's wonderful to hear. This is the part of the program we have that's called the reading list, Shannon, so I'm going to go first and give you a couple minutes to kind of collect your thoughts. So I've got a couple of books here that I've pulled from the impressive and deep library of John MacArthur. These are two that I have read. Folks, there are many, many more. This man has been a prolific preacher and evangelist and writer. But one of his books is called Right Thinking in a World Gone Wrong. And so this book is really trying to help people understand, to face the greatest challenges facing Christians today, which is the powerful influence of secular thinking. So that's one of our books. The second one, which is kind of a companion to it, is called Stand Firm, another John MacArthur book. And here he talks about how the Christian life is a war for holiness. Our calling is to be set apart, lands us in the crosshairs of a culture that opposes God's truth. Even as the world around us is changing, our battle remains the same: to withstand the temptation to compromise in sin or retreat from suffering. And the lockdowns are really very much about that, as we talked about with our guest today. So, Shannon, do you have some ideas, some books that have touched you that you think would be, or some other resources that you think would be helpful or useful to our viewers in gaining a better understanding of the topics that we've been covering today, and especially that are featured in your film?
Yeah, I got a few of them swimming through my head right now. I'll give you just as far as foundational Christian fundamental of what a Christian is, what the gospel is. My pastor wrote a book. I think it was maybe one of his first books or close to it, one of his big, most successful books. It's called The Gospel According to Jesus.
Right.
I think every Christian should read that. I think everybody should read it if you're not a Christian. It's The Gospel According to Jesus. That was instrumental in my walk with Christ. Another book that is in my mind is, are you familiar with Samuel Rutherford?
Yes.
Yeah. So I believe he was in the late 1500s when he
Yeah.
wrote his book, and I believe it's called Lex Rex, correct?
Right. Yeah.
And that goes through the idea of why the law is king, Lex, Rex, not Rex, Lex.
Right.
The king is law, would be Rex, Lex. He says Lex, Rex, which is the law is king, not the king is law. And that is a Christian principle. That's what I was talking about earlier. That comes from the Bible.
Shannon, we're so grateful for you to take the time to be with us. We know you're very busy getting ready for the premiere of the movie, but God bless you for the work that you're doing in creating these wonderful films. And we wish you much continued success in all the work that you're doing on behalf of Grace Church, and really on behalf of Christians everywhere. So thanks very much for being our special guest today.
Well, thanks for having me. It was my pleasure. I loved it. Thank you for doing what you do. Thank you for representing Coates and Stevens and helping them, and doing this show and doing what you guys are doing up there in Canada. It's greatly needed.